Large virtual audience this morning and throughout the conference. So we appreciate you all being here. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. A few housekeeping things for our attendees in person as well as those joining at home. You will be emailed your CE certificate in the next week. I encourage you to take either notes at home of those sessions that you attend, or if you're here with us in person, you can use the program that should have been in your bag when you picked up your name tag and your registration information. Additionally, our exhibit hall is only available, the room is only available to us today. And so make sure you visit our exhibitors today because we will not have it available in the morning. Additionally, it's kind of an important place because that's where the food is at the breaks. So. All right, and with that, I think we will, Dean, I think it's 8 o'clock, so we will get started.
Well, thank you, Dr. Biggs, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our College of Veterinary Medicine Fall 2021 Fall Conference. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Anelli, I would like to take a few moments to welcome and thank individuals that made this event possible today. So Dr. Biggs, Beef Cattle Extension Veterinarian and CE Director, and her team led by CE Coordinator Christine Nichols, and students employees, Bailey Schiffelbein, Hannah McMaccoon, Reagan Wilson, and a very special thanks to our pre-veterinary student volunteers that are assisting with virtual moderation. Ashley Ginn, Shaylee Drigger, Piper Turner, Hannah Hill. It's always good to have pre-veterinary students helping us. Sharon Worrell for organizing the alumni activities and Dr. Anelli's visit. And thank you to Dorinda Blakeney for her promotional skills. Thank you to our exhibitors and sponsors. Please visit the exhibit booth today when you have a chance. Thanks to our speakers that have traveled from across the country to join us. Thank you, Dr. Loafman and the class of 1963 for your continued sponsorship of our keynote speaker. Joining us from Oklahoma State University Extension Leadership, our Associate Vice President, Dr. Damoyne Doig, and Assistant Director of State Programs, Dr. Randy Taylor. Welcome. Very special welcome to Dean Emeritus Michael Lorenz, that has joined us, and Representative John Talley has also joined us. We welcome our alumni, veterinary students, and our international collaborators from France, Ethiopia, and Kenya that are joining us virtually. Our attendance numbers, and thank you, Dr. Biggs, for sharing this, for veterinary professionals for this conference is equivalent to years past. But you may notice that the lecture halls may be a little bit sparse because we have about 50% that have joined us remotely. I believe it was around 60 some. So please visit the OSU CVM Mega booth with representatives from across the college, including the teaching hospital, ODO, and be sure to visit the OSU Foundation booth with Ashley Hesser as well. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce the class of 1963 Distinguished Lecturer Series keynote speaker, Dr. Joseph Anelli. A native of the state of New York, Dr. Anelli received a BS degree in biology from St. Francis College in Brooklyn, New York, and later a master's in zoology with an emphasis on wildlife management from Long Island University. He received his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree at Araneta University in Quezon City, Philippines. Dr. Anelli currently serves as Executive Vice President of the National Association of Federal Veterinarians. He is the former director of the USDA One Health Coordination Center. In that role, he covered a broad range of policy and program development. Dr. Anelli believes veterinarians are truly the first line of defense for human health, ensuring that we are providing wholesome, abundant, affordable food for the United States and the world. Throughout his 32-year federal career, he applied his innovative thinking to the eradication of avian influenza from live bird market systems in New York City, eradicating pseudorabies from the United States domestic herds, and introducing the Incident Command System to veterinary services, building the APHIS emergency programs activities to a world-class response organization. While in detail to the USDA Secretary's office, Dr. Anelli managed the White House Avian Pandemic, leading the International Avian and Pandemic Influenza Response Team, developed a crisis management center at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, led USDA on global health security at the White House, initiated the USDA-wide One Health Joint Working Group, the federal Interagency One Health Working Group, and finally, founding and leading the One Health Coordination Center, and remains very active with the World Health Organizations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Anelli.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Risco. What all of that means is I'm 50 miles away from home, so I'm an expert. The topic that I was asked to cover is One Health. And I was thinking about why we should be covering One Health. Is there anyone in here who thinks One Health is a bad idea? Yeah, I didn't think so. So how much could I say about One Health? I think what we need to do is look at why that concept of One Health is easy, but why implementing it is so hard. Do I need to point this way? It's kind of hard to do One Health. See? Told you. Tell you what.
Click on the desktop and start it over. It's responding to the Zoom prompts.
There we go. Okay.
I'm going to stay back here just in case.
Excellent.
Tell me the next slide.
Sure. Thank you. So, the future of One Health actually starts in the past. It started with Aristotle in 384 BC, where he talked about looking at the anatomy of humans and animals and doing comparative analyses. We then moved forward to the 1850s with Rudolf Virchow, looking at this as well and comparing diseases between animals and people and coining the term zoonoses. James Steele, who I think some of you in the audience may have met, have known, started in 1947 the Veterinary Public Health Unit at CDC. So the first time that we've introduced the veterinary community into the public health organization there. And then Calvin Schwabe coined the term One Medicine. So today that's morphed into One Health. But so over all of this time, so where have we gotten over all of this time? We asked already, does anybody think this is a bad idea? Let's go to the next slide. So it's a good idea, a way to better use the skills that we have, a better way of collaborating so that we reduce costs and so on. Next slide. Go ahead. And to fully integrate this among the ministries, agriculture, and public health, governmental organizations worldwide, and private society. Let's go to the next one. This is just a history of all of the things that have occurred, starting in the 50s, going through to influenza in Hong Kong. This was the first time that we recognized that influenza viruses were being transmitted from poultry directly to people. It was an H5N1 virus in Hong Kong, and people working in live bird markets there became infected with this, and many of them died. A little while later, in 2003, 2004, that H5N1 virus spilled out of Hong Kong and China into the rest of Southeast Asia, creating a big concern because it appeared that this virus, when it went into people, caused about a 50% mortality. The reality was that there were probably subclinical infections, and only those that had significant infections went on to die. But still, it looked like we might have had a worldwide pandemic of H5N1 avian influenza that had a 50% mortality in people. Other strains that caused infections in people were the H5s, the H7s, and also H9s. So now in the US, when we have even a low pathogenic avian influenza outbreak, we need to consider what strain it is and whether or not it has the potential to become a human pathogen. 2009 was an interesting pandemic of a human origin H1N1 virus. And the reason it was interesting is it was a pandemic, meaning it spread all over the world, but it was a very mild strain. It didn't cause any more mortality than the seasonal influenza strains did. So while since 2005, the world raised its awareness of influenzas and had serious concern about pandemics and put a lot of money into activities that did pandemic planning and so on, this 2009 pandemic was so mild that everybody just sort of threw their hands up and said, well, what are we doing all this preparation for? We've now been through a pandemic, and you know, it's not a big deal. Let's go to the next slide. So I talked about the Hong Kong situation. The other challenges that we've had was developing a national strategy of how we would work together between the human public health component and the animal health component of influenzas. One of the challenges in India, for example, when I was there for one of these outbreaks, is the public health community decided that all of the birds, whether they tested positive or not, needed to be depopulated in this entire area of West Bengal. The challenge with that is it prevented transmission of influenza from birds to people, but it also eliminated the only source of protein that these folks had, because they raised their chickens in their backyards or had just small farm operations that provided income for them. So the public health community completely eliminated a food source and a source of income. There needed to be some balance that we put into this between the two. If you go back one, please. The pandemic influenza strategy was put together in the White House in 2005. And there was an implementation plan that had 128 specific action items. And for each of those action items, it listed the different organizations that would be working together, whether it be CDC and USDA or the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. What else was put into this was a significant pandemic plan so that if there was a pandemic, that these would be the activities that would be followed. The challenge here was that there was an assumption made that if influenza were to be introduced, it would be introduced into the United States and not start here, that we would identify the early cases and we would be able to sort of cordon off that outbreak by closing schools, by having people stay home from work. They worked out a lot of the issues about how we could be working from home for a small period of time. The concept originally was for 2 weeks, so the incubation period of the influenza virus, and then open things back up again, and then as the disease popped up in another part of the country, do the same thing there. Sounding familiar to something we've been through this past year and a half. So that was the pandemic plan, which actually was used for COVID. Next, please. It's interesting how incidents get attention. George Bush read the book by John Barry and went to his advisors and said, could this happen today? And they said yes. And that's why all of the money and all of the activities were put into the pandemic planning efforts for avian influenza. Next. And as you know, influenza viruses are sort of ubiquitous in waterfowl and are transmissible to just about every other species. So when you have this sort of thing going on, you need to be prepared for any one of these potentially spilling over into that human population and making sure that it's controlled in animals. So that was one of the first times the human medical community recognized that if you controlled the disease in animals, you could avoid it from spilling over to people. There were ministerial meetings held every year over this avian influenza, and it was the first time that many countries' ministers of health and ministers of agriculture were at the same meeting and understanding where the animal disease was and how it was spilling over into the human population. Next slide, please. These were some of the planning documents that were put together in 2006 to help with this whole possible pandemic. And if you look at the bottom line, it not only started with that national plan, but went down into state, tribe, and local governments to do this same sort of planning as well. Next. There were these ministerial meetings that I mentioned, and for the first time in, I think that was 2007, the vision of the New Delhi conference mentioned One Health, and that we have to address these challenges in a One Health holistic sort of way. And that really was the tipping point for how the world was beginning to look at these. It was the first time that the veterinary community was spotlighted as a group that needed to work in these areas to protect human health. Next slide, please. That session put together a report from the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization stating these same things. So ever since then, the idea of One Health was easy. It seemed, of course, we should do this. It just makes perfect sense. Next slide. But if we fast forward through some of these activities, we had an influenza A H1N1 pandemic. H1N1 is a common influenza virus in swine. So the Centers for Disease Control initially called this swine flu, and the media picked up on that. The challenge with that was that it hit the swine industry pretty hard just because people didn't trust eating pork anymore, that our export markets dropped because we had this disease in swine. Well, we didn't have it in swine. It was a human infection. There were, however, in state fairs, 4-H children that were being infected with this H1N1 virus by being in contact with swine. Next, please. there were all sorts of things put together to be educational material for how to break the transmission of disease, many of those things that became useful in COVID. Yes. But it wasn't just the influenzas that were causing these spillover events from animals to people. There was the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which was a coronavirus of camels. And it was not only infecting camels, but it was affecting people in the Middle East where camels are used for transportation and racing and so on. Next slide. There was also severe acute respiratory syndrome. It spilled over from the civet cat. I don't know if any of you know about a particular type of coffee that is supposedly highly mellow. You feed coffee beans to the civet cat. They poop out those beans. They're washed, roasted, and used for coffee. So civet cats are in... Don't laugh, it's actually pretty good. I was on one of the farms in Indonesia. But once you get over the idea that they've been pooped out, it's not bad. The other thing that came up, all of this around the same time period of 10 years or so, was Nipah virus. Nipah virus was found in the town of Nipah in Malaysia. What was going on here was there were deforestation efforts being done, and as the bat habitat was knocked down, essentially, those bats came into closer contact with pigs. The Nipah virus is a commensal organism in bats, but apparently, nobody knew because there was no overlap previously, that same virus can be transmitted to pigs, and it's lethal. That same virus coming out of pigs can be transmitted to people, and that's lethal as well. So there was this situation going on around the same time. So this idea of we need to behave in a One Health way seemed to be easy. These things came up all the time. By the way, just as an aside, this Nipah virus is still occurring in places like Bangladesh. There is a special liqueur kind of product, a liquor-containing product that's made from the water of coconuts. And the way they do it is they take coconuts that are maturing on the tree and they cut a hole in the top of them so that it's exposed to the air, and then the stuff inside ferments from the coconut milk. Well, not only does it ferment that way, but it attracts bats. Bats go to it and urinate in it and dump saliva in it and dump the Nipah virus into it as well. So people were getting infected with Nipah virus from drinking this liqueur product of coconuts. So that should be the end, right? All of these things have happened. What more can happen? Well, the reality is that's not the end. That turned out to just be the beginning. So why is it hard to work together? Well, in some work by Frederick Lebor, he talked about reinventing organizations. The organizations that we have across the United States and generally around the world were developed during an industrial age. It was when we were building widgets of some sort, whether those were automobiles or locomotives or whatever, and segmenting each of those activities as separate entities made a lot of sense. The people who put the engine into the car are not necessarily the same people who put the electrical systems into those cars. Different skills. So even within our federal government and state governments, we created these stovepipes where each of the federal agencies, and even within those federal agencies, had these multiple single activity, single expertise And that made sense for a long time. The challenge, though, is that the expertise from one silo was needed along with the expertise from a different silo. So the folks who knew something about those bats that we talked about with Nipah virus also needed to know something about forestry and the ecology of those bats. They also needed to know something about agriculture and where those pigs were being raised. They also then needed the skills of human medicine to be able to treat people who became infected with this. So the thing that began to change is we went from the word bureaucracy, meaning highly efficient, effective processes, to where we are today, where these things are really interchangeable and need to have that kind of flow across those stovepipes, but we don't have them yet in our organizations. The other thing is we're people. Biggest problem we have is we are people. We are a reactionary species. Remember I said that George Bush read a book and started asking questions about whether it could happen today. Well, that book was written because the 1918 pandemic was a pretty significant wake-up call for the world on what could potentially happen. No one really cared. It wasn't something that was in their face happening today. So they were able to be complacent about this. It took many years to create fire departments. In fact, the original fire departments were simply contracted among a number of households to protect just their community. So it took many years to move in the direction of having some sort of service that covered the entire community and was available in a much more economical way than having each group of homes have their own fire department that they supported. We are emotionally reactive. So only when we have a serious event occur and people die do we take notice. The worst thing that happened to us was the 2009 pandemic because it was mild. People started to get ramped up because of H5N1 and recognized that this was something that we really needed to deal with. Then we had what we called a pandemic, and it was really hard to re-educate people, the decision makers, the policy makers, the budget appropriations groups, that it could still be serious, that we had a pandemic, meaning it spread throughout the world, but it had degrees of significance. And this one was low significance, so all of those attempts at developing pandemic preparedness began to decline. The money into those activities declined, the activities declined. The plans I showed you before that went from a national plan down to state and local governments, well, there wasn't any funding available anymore for those state and federal government, state and local governments to continue that pandemic planning. So it went by the wayside. Let's go back a second. I want to just read something here. When we feel stressed, angry, or hurt, we tend to react impulsively. So if I say to someone, and I'm using this as an example, not that this actually happened, when I say to somebody from CDC that they can't bleed those sheep because they're pregnant and you're going to stress them and they're going to abort, even though you need to test for Q fever on that farm, you should not test this category of animal. They get very reactive. I mean, agriculture has no business telling them what to do with human disease, that they can just step right in and do whatever they want regardless of the ramifications of that. So there's this reactionary thing. It was very difficult to work through that reaction that, well, you're impeding our public health responsibility. No, we are balancing a public health responsibility with an animal health responsibility and coming up with a very viable option. That's difficult for people to do. How do we reduce that emotional reactivity? We had to create a system in which there were, we lowered that stress level, and we had to do active listening. We had to get the folks that were saying this is an imperative, that we must do this for human health, and get them to listen for a minute that says there is a random sample of animals that you can do which will give you the same confidence of the prevalence of the disease on this farm without having to test this particular category of animal. And when they sort of stepped back and listened to that, they could rationalize that, yeah, maybe there is an acceptable way to do this. It's not the way we've always done it, but it's the way we should be doing it in the future. So we really, the reason this is hard is because we're dealing with humans and human emotion and human reactivity. So we need to be looking not within the medical community or the veterinary community for how to implement One Health. We need to be reaching out to the psychologists and sociologists to help us overcome these human challenges that we have. Let's see. Most of us react all the time. We try to put our own reactions and emotions aside to truly hear what other people are saying. I think in every one of your cases, you've probably been in a situation where you found this very, very hard to do. You believed in something very, very strongly. You had experience and a background to say that you were right in this situation, and it makes it very difficult to listen to, well, maybe you are right, but maybe there's an alternate way to do this that accommodates what your concerns are and still accomplishes the goal that we're looking for here. Yep. So we tried this in the federal government, and it was somewhat successful. We created across, and so I used to work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I also worked with the White House on these activities. And the White House, you may have heard controversy about the Trump administration eliminating a pandemic preparedness group within the White House. Well, they did. But everyone who's on that group was a federal employee who worked for other federal agencies. They weren't fired. They simply stopped meeting one day a week at the White House, but continued to do that work from their federal agencies and continued to call across federal agencies to collaborate. So there was a great way of coordinating out of the White House that was stopped, but the activities still continued. Leave it on that slide, please. When there was all this big emphasis toward avian influenza and pandemic preparedness, we had organizations that met at the White House, that came together from all of the different federal agencies, met at the White House and took guidance about what needed to be done, then went back to their home agencies, whether it's USDA, CDC, Health and Human Services, USAID, went back and began to work on those activities, accomplish them, and then come back together to coordinate activities. So, since we had a very successful activity like that going on, we wanted to keep it going. So we converted our avian and pandemic influenza organizations into One Health organizations. They would continue to work on avian and pandemic influenza, but would also begin to look at other diseases as well. No, go back, please. That's okay. Yeah, I'm looking at my time as to how much I have and how much I can spend on those slides, so I think we're good. We created a One Health Coordination Center within USDA APHIS Veterinary Services. That One Health Coordination Center became a center of gravity for all of USDA so that their activities that were being conducted were coordinated among those among all of the different parts of USDA, and we encouraged other federal agencies to create similar structures. CDC created a One Health office. The Department of Interior created a One Health office. So we now had multiple nodes of people across federal agencies that would work together rather than in their own stovepipe, working together across departments and agencies to share activities and to share knowledge. The key thing about One Health that I like to say is that I don't know what I don't know. So you get these various groups of people together and you say, here is my problem. Do any of you have solutions for this problem? Or what are the ramifications of my taking this action? And what will it do for future outcomes? Let's look at the next one. So I think there needs to be a generational change. I think there are enough old folks like me that are set in our ways and are saying, here's how it has to be done, when there are some new ideas that can come into this and think about doing this in ways that no one has ever thought about. I was sort of ostracized from the World Health Organization because they had just made a policy statement that One Health can be accomplished by keeping all of these stovepipes, that we didn't need to create one common agency to just do One Health. And I was at a meeting where I said that that's likely not going to happen. That, you know, the way we thought about things, if you continue to do the things you used to do, you will continue to get the outcomes you used to get. So you had to do something different. So perhaps, and I said this to just sort of shake up the community, is maybe there needs to be one federal agency that's called One Health, and it's made up of the right people out of CDC and out of USDA and out of the Department of Interior and out of Fish and Wildlife Service and out of the rest of the human medical community to work on these common sorts of problems. An organization like that was sort of put together in the United Kingdom in 2001, or just after 2001. Anybody remember what happened in the United Kingdom in 2001? They had a major foot and mouth disease outbreak. That was the turning point for them to recognize that they needed to work together. They had on Page Street a 7-story building that was their headquarters for their animal health unit. And within that building, they had one small room set up as their emergency coordination center. They thought that's all they were going to need if they had an major animal disease outbreak. Turned out that they ended up, during the foot and mouth disease situation, using all 7 floors, with the epidemiologists taking up one whole floor. Another floor was taken up by the financial folks that were paying indemnity and checking that the right number of animals that were depopulated or therefore paid for, and so on. So it took that reaction to a major disease outbreak to have them work in a way that they now collaborate, not just with among the different components of DEFRA, but also with the Ministry of Health. The other thing is we are still in competition with each other. I mean, the way Congress gives out money is the Health Committee, Health Education, something in pensions. Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee gives money to Health and Human Services and CDC. The Agriculture Committee gives money to agriculture. When you have zoonotic diseases that pass between agriculture and human health, the folks that are giving that money, as well as the folks who are using that money, have an immediate reaction that, well, I was given that money to do this task, therefore I have to do it myself. Good example of that, CDC was called by, I think it was the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that they had an outbreak of avian influenza. And they wanted a team to come help them. The group at CDC that was going to deploy a team called over to the Southwest Poultry Disease Lab, where David Swain is. David Swain is probably one of the foremost avian influenza researchers in the world, and said, could we send somebody over to talk to you for a couple of hours to learn about avian influenza before we go on this? Rather than saying, do you have anybody in your lab who you could send with us that would know this stuff, that could help us so that you could look at the animal health component, we'll look at the human health component and compare. So even there, they were asked, they had money to do it, they were going to go do it, regardless of whether they had the full expertise. So we've still got these sorts of things going on. So going forward, we have to accept that there are managerial changes that we are going to have to follow in order to make this One Health activity actually function. We also need to add new tools to the toolbox. There are a couple of things that were developed that would help bridge that collaboration piece. One of them was something we called OSMART, which was One Health Systems Management and Resource Tool. It was designed at a state level to bring together the human and animal components of a disease response and have them work through, during a disease outbreak, what would you, the human health community, be doing? What would you, the animal health community, be doing? What would you, the wildlife community, be doing? And then looking at these activities and seeing where there were crossover points that say, okay, at this point, we need to have the wildlife folks and the human health folks working together on developing this surveillance system, and so on. It would bring that kind of thinking together, but even more importantly, it brought the people together. It had that personal connection that said, I now know and trust the person from that other stovepipe, and I am more willing to work with them in the future now that I've met them, I know them, and we understand each other. Hold on. Yeah, I'm at a disadvantage of not being able to see my own slides, so I'm trying to look over here to see what I've actually put together here. So we need to push the human health community to where it's more painful for them to remain how they have been in the past than to change and accept this working together, because working together works. Let's go to the next one. So it would seem like this Ebola outbreak that occurred in the Democratic Republic of the Congo should have kind of been the end of this, right? We had all these other things happen. Now all of a sudden we've got an Ebola outbreak. The cause of that Ebola outbreak was likely a bat carrying the organism. There was a documented thing of some kids that were playing with the dead bats that fell from near this tree, and caused that Ebola outbreak. And let's go on to the next one. But then we end up with a SARS-CoV-2 situation. It started sort of innocuously. In fact, China was saying that there were no clinical cases. The idea that it was going to spread to the United States was not something that people took terribly seriously. It was something that was halfway around the world. But where are we today with coronavirus, the SARS coronavirus 2, or COVID-19, the disease? and the emphasis that must be placed, even though we don't know the origins exactly of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we have some indication that it is likely from some animal source and somehow jumped into humans. So the idea of the veterinary profession being important in helping perhaps to prevent these things from spilling over into humans, this list are all of the different livestock and domestic species that have been infected with COVID-19. And a concern I have is a report that just came out recently of a documented case of dogs becoming infected with coronavirus from their owner. Their owner became infected with COVID-19, and then both of the dogs were identified as being positive as well. So we know that there was at least a transmission from a human to a dog. We don't know how the second dog was infected, whether it was that same route or whether it was dog-to-dog transmission. And we don't know whether there can be transmission from dogs back to people. So it raises in my mind the question of, do we need a coronavirus vaccine for dogs that will take care of this SARS-CoV-2 virus? The other thing that we have reports on is white-tailed deer being tested positive for COVID-19. The challenge with that is, what is the actual contact rate between humans and white-tailed deer that may be a concern? There are also enough of those deer that have tested positive that there is the concern that there is efficient deer-to-deer transmission, and therefore white-tailed deer could become a reservoir of COVID-19 in the United States. So these are the imperatives that we need to implement One Health in order to take care of these sorts of significant problems. Let's go to the next one. Oh, yeah. Unintended consequences of actions. The reason we need to work together. The public health community in New Orleans thought that the places where disease transmission are going to occur is in bars and restaurants in New Orleans. So the best way to control that was just to close those bars and restaurants and not have people commingling in these areas and spreading virus. The problem is they didn't bring together enough expertise in different areas to find out whether there are going to be any unintended consequences to that. Quite frankly, I don't know that I would have thought of the unintended consequences of that. But what ended up happening was, as soon as you closed restaurants, you stopped food waste from being deposited in dumpsters behind the restaurants, and you end up with the rat population moving out into the streets and into homes looking for a food source because you've eliminated the native rat population of New Orleans, and you get scenes like this where you just see rats running around the streets in New Orleans because the restaurants were closed. So these are the sorts of stories we need to bring up to demonstrate that all of these things are multi-sectoral, and you need to bring together all of those sectors to work together on these problems. Whether you think they have a role or not, once you ask the question, you may find out that they would have a solution for this rat population, or at least somehow take advantage of that situation to control the rat population simultaneously. Let's go to the next one. So, I think I may have put on one of these slides. Will it take an act of Congress to actually implement One Health? Probably, and that's being worked on. There is a Advancing Emergency Preparedness Through One Health Act that's been introduced into both houses of Congress, and it is supported by both Democrats and Republicans. And what it asks is that the federal agencies come together and develop a framework for how they will work together during these intersectoral disease situations. So what's expected once this passes is that the federal agencies will put together a report within 6 months that will talk about who will do what during an emergency. So how will they work together if there's a COVID-19 outbreak in an area where they've got to close restaurants? Who will work together on that? Who from Fish and Wildlife Service will be engaged with the medical community in making those kinds of decisions so that the unintended consequences can be considered? And if you do that in advance and you have all of the people, because regardless of the legislation, this is all dependent upon people working with other people. You need to meet those people before the situation occurs. Developing that framework will get them to meet with each other and get them to agree to a way in which they will work together. Let's go to the next one. AVMA, you may have seen this email from them, but AVMA has a government relations division, and they put out an email asking for support for this Advancing Emergency Preparedness Through One Health Act. And they had a link to a letter. They wrote a letter that could be sent to your member of Congress. You click on the link, you put your name and information in it. It then brings up a sample of that letter that you can modify in any way you want to put in your personal feelings about it, any unique examples that you can give of why this would be important. And then based on your address, it sends it to your representatives in Congress. So there are going to be more of these things around other pieces of legislation that you will likely see. Let's go to the next one. So yeah, will it take an act of Congress? There are a lot of people already working on what those acts of Congress will be. One thing that's already happened is in the appropriations language for the agriculture and public health community was directing them to do this framework even without that piece of legislation passing. So that should have already been initiated. Let's go to the next one. There are a number of other things that are happening. USDA just announced a proposed framework they have. They received $300 million to put together surveillance for coronavirus, and in particular, of course, COVID-19. And they're looking at doing surveillance activities within the white-tailed deer, but also other species. So there's now money that's being attached to the animal health side of One Health. That was one of the biggest problems previously. These were almost unfunded mandates that the animal health community were being asked to do, yet the money was going into the public health community, not the animal health community. These are a number of global pandemic prevention and biosecurity bills that have been introduced into Congress. Let's go to the next one. And also, we're beginning to work on a number of other bills that provide additional authority for zoonotic diseases. For example, you may know, I know you will know, that APHIS did not have the authority to work with something like E. coli 0157 H7 in cattle because it was a commensal organism in cattle. Didn't cause any disease of cattle. APHIS's authority was for diseases of livestock. So they didn't get involved in that E. coli situation. Now there's a piece of legislation that's going to be introduced that gives them the authority to work on zoonotic diseases, whether or not that disease causes illness in livestock. As long as it causes illness in people, they can now work on things like that. So that'll be a major change for them. And what's most important with that is that there is an appropriation associated with it. So it's not an unfunded mandate. They're actually going to get the authority and they're going to get the money to work on it. Some of these suggestions. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, that'll be my last slide there in a second. But some of these bills that are being passed have funding to go along with them, so it's likely that there will not only be the requirement to do it, but there'll be the money to do it, which is unique in this situation. And I'll end it with that and see if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
Should we be concerned about canine influenza jumping species into humans?
Yes, I think we should be concerned. We don't know what creates that trigger or what mutation is necessary to make the influenza viruses become competent transmitters in humans. So yeah, I'm concerned about it. I think we should make sure we vaccinate all dogs for influenza to try and reduce the burden of virus that people are exposed to. Yeah, I think one day we may find that that is a zoonotic disease. I don't think it's something that should keep you up at night, but it's something we should be vigilant for and looking at whether or not there are humans and animals with the same disease at the same time, and therefore there could have been transmission. Yes, sir.
Dr. Nelly, first, thank you for all the work you've done through the years. I've got a little bit of background in some of this, but you mentioned throughout this, and I know you had limited time here this morning, but we didn't really get into the prevention component of this to start with, and then the response. Most of this was response. Yep. As we look at the One Health, and we look back at, say, West Nile, none of our departments' systems talk to each other.
Right.
And so I was the national West Nile coordinator for CDC.
Oh.
And so as we look at this, none of the systems from the state to the federal level would talk to each other. So you couldn't get data from animals and correspond it with people and so on and so forth. And we also didn't mention here this morning the political connotations. You mentioned Nipah, but what happened there was very similar to swine flu in the US, where we ended up disposing of millions and millions of pigs, and it was a political ramification between different ethnic groups, Chinese, Muslim, and so on and so forth. So you also mentioned in your talk this morning how we need to rethink this, and I'm kind of throwing out for your comments is it time that we stopped having human and veterinary medicine stovepipes? Is it time that we recognize that this is a separate specialty and that being educated in this takes much more than a veterinary degree or an MD degree or an even advanced degree in either one of those fields?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I said that I had raised that at one of these meetings, saying perhaps there needs to be a separate agency that deals with One Health so that you break down those barriers. I would hope that that's not possible, because I think we'll lose a lot by creating a single specialty for One Health. I think One Health is the drawing of expertise from multiple specialties to work together on a problem. So you identify the problem, bring together the multidisciplinary team to work on it. But I don't know that that's going to be possible with the politics of these situations that go on around us. So, yes.
Just so we stay on time, I know we probably have questions from the virtual audience, and I apologize, but just so we stay with our schedule, we'll have to stop questions at this point.
Okay.
So.
Very good. Well, thank you very much.
On behalf of the class of 1963.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Nelly, thank you very much. You had an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And this presentation certainly confirmed the decision that our class made about 8 years ago to make the theme of this lectureship One Health.
Yeah.
You certainly confirmed that, and I want to thank you too for speaking to the students for the first time we've been able to do that, and it was an excellent presentation for them, and we thank you very much for being here and sharing your information with us. Now, on behalf of the class, we present you with this token of our appreciation.
Thank you. And, yeah, you're quite welcome, and it was an honor to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we will take a short break, like 1 or 2 minutes, to transfer our microphones from one speaker to the next. Thank you all for being here. And Dr. Nelly, are you going to have time to be around today?
I'll be around all day.
Great.
Yep.
It was great. Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Probably not possible. Yes. Are you working on the clicker?
We're trying to figure this out.
Sweet.
We've tested it 2 or 3 times, and I may have to advance for you. Sorry. Okay, so let's do this.
You're going to do it?
Going. We're going to make sure it works, and then as long as it works through the first 2 or 3 slides, I think we should be safe.
Sweet. I'd aim at that, or I aim here?
Sorry.
Where do I aim? At that computer, right? Doesn't matter. Sweet. All right. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, are you good to go?
I got a lot of words. I'm good. I'm good.
Let's, I want to check we're going to check mic now for Dr. Rudd. Okay.
Hello.
And Dr. Rudd, when I give you, we're going to start here.
Okay.
Test.
Test.
Are you ready?
I'm ready when you are.
Thank you again, Dr. Nelly.
I'm going to stay here and listen.
I'm good.
All right, I'm going to need to hold this so I don't mess up the button.
That's all right.
Good.
I'm good right now, but I'll grab it if I need
I don't
it.
want to touch it, so.
You're good. You're good.
Okay, now give it a try and see if it's going to.
Oh. Hey, look at that. Perfect. I'm good.
All right, everyone.
Let's double check. I don't know if you're live on the in-room mic.
This one's on. This one's on. This one.
Why did we say low battery?
Says low battery. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Do you want me to take it off?
No. That way they don't hear our conversations. All right, help me out here.
Yeah.
It's deceiving. It's just the on. If it was low battery, it's blinking.
Perfect.
I just heard you say that. I just want to make sure.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, what about this one?
All right.
Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
go ahead and talk to the room and see.
Hello. 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 I feel like it's
It's
not
over here.
Oh,
This is the room mic, the non-fuzzy
this one is.
Yeah.
All right. Hello.
All right, everyone, thank you so much.
Do you
We
want
are
it?
going, well, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the room? Dr. Snyder, can you hear me? He's ignoring
Where
me.
is Dr. Snyder? Can you hear us?
Dr. Bassett, are you here? Good, thank you, Dr. Bassett. Excellent. Let's run over here for just a second.
Yes. I feel like I'm on a leash.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
All right, I think we have some of our technical issues with our slide advancer corrected at this point. So to try to stay on time as best we can, it is really my privilege to introduce Dr. Jennifer Rudd. Dr. Rudd is a graduate of 2011?
2011. It's my 10-year.
10-year anniversary. Go, oh, we maybe have a few 2011s. Dr. Cole in the back's like, newbies. Dr. Rudd is a board-certified veterinary microbiologist and, again, an alum of OSU CVM. After earning her DVM, she completed an internship in small animal surgery and medicine at the University of Missouri, followed by a few years in small animal practice. Dr. Rudd eventually acknowledged her destiny as an academician and teacher, returning to her alma mater to complete her doctorate in veterinary biomedical sciences. Her research in respiratory infectious disease is the focus on immune response to polymicrobial pneumonias, especially in influenza pandemic models. She continues to be involved in a variety of collaborative research projects, including studies in SARS-CoV-2. Dr. Rudd is now entering her third year on faculty here at OSU. She's an avid teacher and lifelong student of all things infectious. In addition, she has a passion for progressive methods of teaching and active learning, and I know that our students agree with that because she is undoubtedly one of the favorites. I will also add, which she didn't include in her bio, she also has adorable children too. So
I do.
With that, I will pass it on to another DVM mom.
Hello. It's good seeing everyone this morning and a few of my students out there. So to make me feel more comfortable, I will probably just look straight at you guys. But it's just really good seeing everyone out here. And what an act to follow. Dr. Anelli was amazing, and one of those people that's just a role model for those of us on the early end of our career and working towards some of those goals and finding our place in this profession. And so I am honored to share the stage, certainly with someone such as him. So I've got a couple things I really want to talk with you guys about this morning. One of those is to kind of get us all on the same page with what we know about SARS-CoV-2 in animals. And then on the other side of it, hopefully to fit and complement what you heard already this morning pretty well, I want to encourage everyone to start to speak as a veterinary community for our role in One Health, and for everyone to kind of feel what their place is, to feel empowered in what that role can possibly be. And so I'm hoping that I can walk through some of my reflections, good and bad, over the last year and a half on how the pandemic has shaped our profession, shaped our research side of things as well, and kind of get everyone hopefully empowered and ready and excited to try and push through this next phase. So there is my mandatory conflict of interest slide. There you go. I don't have any. And because I am an educator, here are your learning outcomes for today. So at the end of this session, you should be able to do these things. But in summary, again, I want people to feel comfortable with what we know as a profession regarding animals and COVID, and then also to start to feel a little more empowered based on what we know about how our profession has actually responded to the pandemic in the last year and a half in a lot of incredibly positive ways, and use that energy to really empower us to continue to advocate moving forward. So, part of this comes down to breaking down the silos a little bit, right? Because when we talk about One Health, it's really easy to say, for all of us to say it's important, right? We're veterinarians, and this is not a new topic for us. We know veterinary medicine and One Health go hand in hand. However, just as Dr. Anelli was saying, sometimes the implementation of that is a little bit hard, and it's really easy in our everyday lives of being the veterinarians that we are, whatever that is, for us to kind of drop some of that One Health responsibility or think, okay, I know there are people taking care of that. They're going to carry that burden a little bit. I need to focus on what I'm doing. The reality is even if you are a companion animal practitioner, okay, which I was for a few years before I came back to academia, companion animal practitioners have incredibly important jobs, right? Very, very important. And then on top of that, we know the human-animal bond is especially essential over the last year and a half, but it's something that's been really important for a long time. There are studies support why the human-animal bond has made huge differences for people, especially in a time of isolation. We're also the sentinels for antimicrobial resistance, disease surveillance, and we're advocates and educators, right? Even if you're not in a classroom, you are talking to clients, you are talking to your staff, you're likely involved in the community to some aspect as well. And so every single one of us has a role in One Health. And so regardless of what little category you're going to throw yourself into here, at the end of the day, we're all just veterinarians, okay? And honestly, even within my classroom, about up to 20% of my students are going to end up in a non-clinical career path, okay? That's another silo we need to break down, okay? Because we've got a lot of clinical veterinarians, and as many of us who are currently in a more non-clinical path know, it's really easy for the public to think that if you're not in a clinical path, you are not a veterinarian, right? Exactly, yes. So it's really easy to see that split, but if we can come together as a profession to talk about veterinary medicine as one whole group, clinical, non-clinical, all these things together, often in both sides. We have people that will be both clinical and non-clinical at the same time, depending on what their job is. So we need to kind of unify and come together on that. I think knowing your sources is really important. If nothing else, over the last year and a half, we are learning that you should probably vet your sources, pun intended. And so on that note, just a little about who I am. I am a veterinarian. I'm currently an assistant professor at OSU. I am a veterinary microbiologist. I have my board certification in microbiology. I'm an educator. I mostly teach second years, but in all honesty, I teach in every year to some extent. And so I do a lot of classroom teaching as well. I am a SARS-CoV-2 scientist, so I'm a 50% teaching, 50% research, and I work with Dr. Craig Miller, who is one of our amazing SARS-CoV-2 researchers and a pathologist, veterinarian, right here at OSU CVM on developing all sorts of really interesting COVID animal model research that we're using to help really make some differences. And so I've gotten involved in a lot of that too. This is me in my astronaut suit, as my 6-year-old likes to call that. So we do a lot of science. I am what I would call an amateur science journalist. I am not trained in that. I have fallen into that field to some extent. And then I'm a mom. So that's also an aspect over the last year and a half that has affected who I am and what I've had to do. I've got 2 at home and 1 obviously very much on the way. So if I get halfway through and find a chair somewhere, you may just have to let me talk from the front row, but we'll see how it goes. I am not a policymaker. I am not a politician, thank goodness. Kudos to those who are. I can't imagine what life has been like. I am not an epidemiologist. I don't have a lot of extensive training in business or in finances. I know science. I'm a veterinarian and I know science. And so that's really who I am. So we're going to talk, I'm going to start with what I'm most comfortable with, okay? Which is, what do we know about SARS-CoV-2? So what do we know about it in the animals that we see every day? Where are we at with that research? Are we seeing cases of this? How do we communicate that with our clients who are potentially going to read a lot of very alarmist headlines and have some really good questions about the risks that their animals potentially even pose back to them, right? So we're going to focus on that for about the first half, and then I want to talk a little bit about how our veterinary profession has been impacted by the pandemic, what our response has been, and what are we going to do about that moving forward. Okay, so what do we know about SARS-CoV-2 in animals? One step back from that, we know that a significant amount of emerging infectious disease is coming from animals, anywhere from 60 to 75%. But if you look over the last 2 to 3 decades, a large amount of that emerging infectious disease that we see in people is zoonotic in origin, okay? And so this is becoming something that is increasingly important as we continue to move forward into the future as well. We know that a lot of these are foodborne illnesses, part of animal tissues, products. A lot of these have wildlife reservoirs. That can sit on either end, right? We could be in the wildlife now and have the potential to make that jump into people, or maybe we could see a human disease that pops back into animals for a while, sits there, disappears a little, flies under the radar, but potentially changes over time and reemerges as something that could be even more problematic in the future. So there are a lot of viruses that find that ability over time to make that jump in order to survive. And so that connection with animals is becoming really increasingly obvious, and how veterinarians are involved in that should be pretty obvious as well, right? Now, it's true that we have also improved our ability to diagnose. So even regardless of that increase in emergence, we're simply finding more of this. We're isolating more viruses before they're even creating huge problems. There is great research going on and technical advancements in how we actually find and identify this disease, okay? Factors that are currently increasing transmission. This is part of the reason we see increase in zoonotic disease right now. Close contact. There's a lot of people, right? A lot of people in this globe. And as we spread and grow, we get closer and closer contact with the animals around us, okay? We have changes in societal norms, food preferences, eating civet poop. Sorry if you were here in the first one, that will make more sense. But we've got different things that we've changed about how we actually interact with animals, how many animals are indoors, in close contact, food preferences, different cultures and food preferences. Okay, there's a lot of different societal changes in the norms that are also adding to that transmission. Globalization. We travel everywhere, right? It used to be a little easier to contain a disease outbreak in one spot because we didn't if you get on your horse and you got to ride for a few days to get somewhere else, it's not going to spread as quickly, right? Now we hop on a plane and we're all over the globe in a moment. And that is really going to add to that potential for that spread and the widespread pandemic potential. And then the last one is a good problem to have. We have increased vulnerable populations. Why do I say that's a good problem? Because that means people are living longer, right? People with immunodeficiencies, organ transplants, just the overall age and our elderly population. Modern medicine has allowed so many of these people to survive for significant amounts of time beyond what they used to several decades ago. But because of that increase in that vulnerable population, we now have a large population of people who, even at these lower infective doses of a virus, can potentially have some very severe disease. So we have to consider that population and that group as we talk about management and control here as well. Coronaviruses. This is not something that's new to us, right? Veterinarians and coronaviruses have gone together since the 1930s. So in the 1930s, we saw an outbreak in the avian population, some really interesting disease, respiratory, enteric, neurologic, widespread symptoms of disease, and we were able to figure out that that was a coronavirus. Once we knew coronaviruses existed, now we find them everywhere, right? And so we've been managing this for a very, very long time. So when we talk about our mammalian species, we are dealing with coronaviruses in many of the species we see regularly. Okay, so FIP, that's a coronavirus. We've got bovine and equine coronaviruses. We've got several canine coronaviruses, both enteric and respiratory. And if you deal at all in the swine health world, we've got some really big deal coronaviruses there. One of which actually caused a pretty big epidemic not all that long ago. With porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. And so we have been there. We have been the front lines for these diseases and for coronaviruses in the past. So yes, COVID-19 might be novel, but the idea that we have health professionals trained in coronaviruses, that's not novel. We are all dealing with that. Regardless of what species we see, we are dealing with coronaviruses. Okay? So, and I apologize that the Zoom is covering up some of this slide. I should have shifted it all down. But I do want you guys to think about, with these coronaviruses, they're really split a little bit, okay? So don't be misled here. Oh man, a lot of the words are gone. I'm not sure why. Okay, so we've got alpha, beta, delta, and gamma coronaviruses. That is not the variant thing. So when you talk about Delta variant, SARS-CoV-2, I'm taking a step back from that and just talking about the coronaviruses as a whole. Okay? And so when we have a lot of alpha coronaviruses that we see, betas are going to be largely things like in human, we've got MERS and SARS, right? And SARS-CoV-2. Those are all in that beta coronavirus category. But we've got many others that we're dealing with as well with that. Some of those are from bat origin. Some of those we haven't figured out. And we're still kind of figuring out where they came from. In fact, one of the coronaviruses that we currently see in people that causes just a common cold, one of those could have potentially come from pigs or cattle at its time, okay? And so that one, back in probably the 1800s, may have been linked to something not quite on the global scale we see now, but a similar entrance where we see that jump from a species we regularly deal with and now emerging as a human disease and becoming endemic over time, and so we see that, okay? There's about at least seven human coronaviruses and a lot of zoonotic potential with those, okay? So we see a lot of these. What do we know about susceptibility and transmission with SARS-CoV-2? So the original zoonosis is still up in the air. We're pretty sure this came from a bat. A lot of coronaviruses do. The question is, how did it get from a bat to a person? Was there some form of direct transmission? Is there an intermediate host? The pangolin's been one that's thrown out that's got some real pull with it, that maybe it came through the pangolin. Maybe there's some other intermediary in there, okay? And so there's a lot of different questions still about what that origin is, but we do feel pretty confident that there is that zoonotic background on there. Whoops.
Sorry, I'm just trying to
Nope.
change your view so that we don't cover up your slides.
Oh, okay, thanks. All right, I'll keep going. Once we get into people, right, what we're trying to figure out now is what happens at that point. So, you have people who are clinically infected with SARS-CoV-2. Is there potential that they then can transmit it back to animals? And it turns out they actually can. And so we've got fairly well-documented cases now, in particular in domestic cats, guys. Domestic cats, we know that people who are sick with COVID-19 can transmit that disease to their cats. Now, the vast majority of those are very likely asymptomatic, okay, or very mild, but they can have mild to moderate clinical disease associated with that as well. And so that's going to be a close contact transmission that we see there. We also know that once a cat has SARS-CoV-2, it can transmit it to another cat. Okay, we've made that link as well at this point. The link we haven't made yet is if that cat can then transmit it back to people. That's a really important question to ask, but we haven't been able to figure that out at this time. And so that reverse zoonosis, or that risk for that transfer from animal to human, is considered very low at this point in time. That's actually really important for us to know, right? When we talk to clients and they're worried about their animals, and they're worried about their animals passing COVID to them, we can say that risk is really considered quite low. In fact, the bigger risk is definitely you passing it to your animal if you are sick with COVID, okay? That being said, we don't know for sure that that risk isn't there or couldn't change and become a bigger thing as this virus continues to mutate and change over time. Non-human primates, obviously, apes and monkeys, highly susceptible to this disease. And you've probably at least seen some headlines in a zoo setting of what we see with those types of outbreaks and transmissions as well. Okay? Mink. So when we talk about mink farming, we have mink farming in the US, we have a lot of mink farming in Europe, and mink are absolutely pretty highly susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 infection, mostly from humans, but then there's actually some really interesting data that shows that we can continue to transmit that and potentially even pass it back to people, where we can see a change in that genetic sequencing that tells us that it went through a mink and came back out on the other side. Not at high rates, not alarming at this time, but that potential is very much there, okay? And so we know that that can occur. Ferrets, white-tailed deer becoming increasingly important in what we are looking at with surveillance. Dogs are considered very low susceptibility for COVID-19, but that doesn't mean that they don't get the virus, right? When we see positive dogs with SARS-CoV-2, potentially with very mild disease to asymptomatic disease, those dogs are not necessarily going to transmit it around, or we haven't seen that yet, and it's a pretty low risk with that. They tend to be in the same household as someone that's really shedding a lot of virus, okay, high viral loads. So what do you think changes that susceptibility? Why are some of those animals, like cats, non-human primates, very susceptible to this virus? Sorry, I'm turning classroom on you guys. Receptors. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So we've got it. I mean, there's also infective doses, there's transmission, there's all sorts of things we can look at. At the end of the day, one of the biggest things here is that the ACE2 receptor that this virus binds to, right, is present in all of, we know ACE2 is important, right? So it's present in our mammalian species, but that receptor is a little bit different depending on what animal you're talking about. And it turns out that that ACE2 receptor in some of these more susceptible species is very similar to what we see in people. And so they have it there. And so that virus is going to bind really quite well to that receptor and create disease. And that's what starts to split these things out. And so there's actually very little difference between a dog and a cat on what that ACE2 looks like, but it turns out that that very little difference is incredibly important in how susceptible that animal is to disease. And so that's one of the things we're looking at that helps to guide us even on surveillance of knowing which animals are more likely to be carrying this infection. So we can look at those receptors, we can look at those differences, and then we can kind of pinpoint these are the animals that we probably need to be monitoring and looking at a little bit closer. And we use that to help guide us in what we're doing. At this time, we don't see a lot of transmission disease, only on an experimental level in cattle, pigs, and poultry, so they're just not a big part, which is encouraging, right? Just don't seem to be a big part of the pandemic at all at this time. So we know quite a lot, right? And this has changed a lot in the last 6 months and really grown on what we know about this. So what do we do about it? So in that rare chance that you do have an animal that you suspect could actually have gotten SARS-CoV-2, okay? So in particular, when you're talking about the cats, dogs, the animals that are in the same house as a symptomatic family that's currently in their own little outbreak. Maybe they break with a fever, they have a bit of a cough, okay? And that animal comes down with those symptoms, and you think, I probably need to test for this just to be sure. There is a way we do that. So I put up here, and it should be in your proceedings later as well, so I won't go into detail on it, but the CDC gives good guidance on which animals we should be testing, because it's not just everything. We don't need to test every single animal with respiratory signs for SARS-CoV-2. But in these specific settings, we may need to start increasing our surveillance to really look at that. Okay? We can do this a lot of different ways. Nasal swabs are great. Oropharyngeal swabs. A lot of this goes through the GI tract. So rectal swabs. Obviously, if you're dealing with exotic large cats, we're probably not going to go in and do a lot of nasal swabs right away. So you can test feces as well and potentially look in that sample for evidence of this viral shedding, and that can help you as well. So initially, you're probably going to send this to just a local diagnostic lab that does that PCR testing. So here, ODAL is kind of the catch for those types of tests, as they should be, right? And so wherever you came from, you've got a lab that's probably local that's doing some of that surveillance and some of that screening, right? And we've had a lot of testing, quite a bit of testing done on animals, which I'm sure Dr. Saliki will talk to you about it when he does the ODAL updates, if you manage to make it to that. But we haven't had a whole lot of positives come from that. But we have had one or two. And so what do you do with that? You know? Well, once you know you have a positive, if you're in an area where we're not really aware of whether we're seeing positives or not, that's really got to go through the USDA. And so that gets sent to the National Veterinary Services Lab. They do confirmatory testing, and then that gets reported to the OIE, which is the World Health type animal organization. So we've got a system in place for how that testing occurs, but on the front lines, you guys are the ones, for a lot of you, that are going to need to think about whether or not that testing even needs to happen in the first place. Apologies again for the color on that, but okay, so what do we do if you have a clinical animal with SARS-CoV-2 infection? Guys, it's supportive care. Most of these are mild. When you do see clinical disease, there aren't any approved specific medications or treatments for SARS-CoV-2 in animals. And so you treat the signs you see, but you've got to add a little bit of caution with that, right? Because we don't know the risk of transmission back to people. And so you've got to consider how you're going to isolate that animal, whether that's in a hospital if they need it, or at home if that's possible. If you have these in your hospital, you need to make sure that the employees that are handling these animals are fully vaccinated and wearing appropriate PPE when they do that, right? We need to make sure that we're not contributing to potentially seeing that jump from animals back to people. And so we use a lot of caution when we handle these cases, and we make sure we protect ourselves as we handle these, but then we really just treat the signs that we see in front of us, okay? And at this time, we don't have vaccination recommended for that. We also don't have a ton of vaccines developed for that. We'll have to see as we move forward if something changes on that front. How do you get back to normal? This should look kind of familiar too. This is kind of what we do with people. Okay, so if you have a positive animal and you're trying to decide when you can end that isolation for that animal, you have to make sure they haven't had any clinical signs for at least 72 hours with no medical intervention. Okay, so it's not like you gave them something to make their fever go down and now they're good for 72 hours. With nothing on board, they're doing normally and they're doing fine. Okay, and we give them about 14 days, and if they've got a good 72 hours and they meet that 14-day mark, they should be good. It's largely based on what we know in people, so we don't know the exact mechanisms of how we see that in animals, but we kind of extrapolate it from human disease, and we put that over on this side as well. So we can test out of it, or we can just give it that time frame and wait. All right. Does anyone, I'm in teacher mode again, but does anyone have any big questions right now about SARS-CoV-2 in animals? Because I'm about to shift.
We do have one question.
Yeah, I'd love to have it now, and that would be a little easier.
Dr. Michael, I asked, are our pets, canine and feline, who are positive to COVID-19 asymptomatic?
Oh, good question. So our pets, so canine, feline, that are come back positive to... Yes. Yes. So the question is, do our pets, so mostly talking about dogs and cats, when they are positive for SARS-CoV-2, are they asymptomatic or have we seen evidence of other types of clinical disease? Does that sound good? Yeah. So a lot of these are asymptomatic, but for a significant number of these, the reason we tested them was because they had disease. It tends to be mild. It's often respiratory, but it can be a little GI as well. So we talk about things like coughing, fever, increased respiratory effort, potentially some ocular and nasal discharge. That's going to be common in a lot of our felids. So domestic cats, large cats in zoo settings, that's what we're seeing there. They can have some enteric manifestation of that as well, diarrhea, vomiting. We know coronaviruses like to go both ways. There's a lot of ACE2 in the gut, and so having that presentation of enteric disease will go hand in hand with that as well. So mostly mild, certainly not fatal, severe disease that we're seeing right now in our domestic animals, but mild to subclinical. Yeah?
Okay. Currently, the coronavirus, the vaccines we're using don't seem to be keeping people from, even if they're vaccinated, from passing it on to somebody else. So we're saying to vaccinate the animals, which might protect them who are not showing signs, but is that going to actually protect the humans from them passing disease anyway?
Super big question, right? Because when we're talking about spread and transmission of SARS-CoV-2, a lot of that's going to depend on how much virus we shed, right? And so we have, with our vaccines, we have these two approaches, where one of them is, can we keep people out of the hospital and from dying from the disease? And then on the other side, it's, can we use that vaccine to slow the transmission and the spread of that virus? What we're figuring out in people, as you guys are well aware and you brought up, is that we're really good at preventing severe disease and hospitalization and death, but then it's a little more of a milder change in that transmission rate and spread. We do see significant difference. So vaccinated people do have about a 3-fold lower with Delta chance of having an infection, being equally as contagious, and actually spreading that. That being said, that's not the 10 to 15-fold difference that we see with severe disease. This is a coronavirus problem, right? We're talking about something that has a relatively low mortality rate and a very high rate of asymptomatic to mild infections. And so when we have upper respiratory infections with coronaviruses, the immune responses that we have to those tend to be more localized and not as robust. When they get in the lungs, things get a little bit bigger, right? So it makes sense that a vaccination can really protect against severe disease, but not necessarily have that same level of protection for that mild disease and that spread. We see a lot of issues with that in creating coronaviruses for the milder viruses that we've seen before. So that'll be something we'll have to navigate when we know more about the animal role. But it's going to be a really important question because we don't see fatal disease in cats and dogs. So is there going to be a vaccine that will actually take that viral shedding from the nose, from the respiratory signs, and bring that down to a level that prevents transmission to people? That being said, you're going to have people too, right, that are going to be much more vulnerable or much less vulnerable. And so the dose of how much is shed is going to affect based on that immune compromised position of that person as well. So lots of little things to work out. And one of the reasons that we certainly are not knocking on the front door of a vaccine for animals quite yet. It's in development, but it's going to be a lot of questions about risk, benefit, and efficacy on that front. All right. Yeah.
Real quick.
Yeah.
The coronavirus vaccine that is being used in zoo collections, how similar in the type of vaccine it is it to the one being used for people?
That's a good question. So I'm not... Yes. Yes. The question is when we see the vaccine being used in zoo settings, such as in our non-human primates, is that vaccine the same as what we're using in people, right? And as far as I'm aware, yes, but that's not my field of medicine, and so I'd have to look and see if that was something that was different. But there are so many similarities between non-human primates and humans that we can make a lot of those translational approaches a little bit simpler than we do with some of our other mammals. All right, I'm going to move on, and then we can circle back if people have questions. So, what are we doing about it? How has this impacted us? Our profession is not the same as it was a year and a half ago. All of us have been in some way changed by this. Most of us are going to have periods of time that we're isolated. We dealt with loss. We dealt with grieving, impacts on our well-being, right? Restrictions on clinical practice and how we actually operate and how we shift our operations with clinical practice. Food supply chain, devastating interruptions with the food supply chain affecting our producers. Concern for COVID in our patients and how we communicate that. I want to bring up, if you can see there, that's my then 5-year-old under that table in a virtual school trying to learn how to read virtually. And for a lot of us, we navigated this at the same time. And I thought this was a good one to share because he's working on an assignment. This is the position that we're in. If I zoom in, this is what we sent to the teacher after this assignment. It says this is as far as he got before rage quitting because the eye wasn't right. And how many of us have at some point in the last year and a half felt that same level of frustration? Am I the only one? Surely there's someone else. So we have this, we're navigating something that feels so unfamiliar, and we're having to completely change how we do things on top of that. So a lot of impacts are going to come from that, okay? But how have we responded to that? That's our bigger question here. What have we done? And we've done our best to continue to give essential services at a time when we didn't necessarily have a lot of public support and appreciation and help in making that happen. So we've had to shift operations. A lot of people have gone curbside for a long time. We've had virtual options, telehealth, limiting new clients, moving to ER only, coming back and forth on how many new clients we can even take, dealing with cash shortfalls and then caseloads that are up and down and up and down, and how do we really predict and manage that, right? And so there is no doubt that clinical practice has been through the ringer in the last year and a half, right? And so the AVMA has published some reports on this. The link is in there if that's something that you're interested in looking at as far as what have we done and how have we responded in the clinical practice world. What about in our food supply chains? Okay, so we have fewer personnel. That's kind of a big deal because when you have fewer personnel, suddenly we don't have drivers to transport, we don't have people in the slaughterhouses, we don't have the caretakers. We saw a significant decrease in restaurant demand for animal products. But then we saw this huge increase in grocer demand for animal products. But guess what? There's a lot of slaughterhouses that aren't equipped to package and process animal tissues for a grocery because it's different than what we do for restaurants. Okay? And they couldn't shift their operations to that same extent. And so this became a really difficult food supply interruption very early on. And in particular in our swine industry, we got hit hard. In the month of April, I think we ended up with an excess of over 215,000 hogs that weren't able to be processed. So what do we do about that, right? And none of the solutions are perfect, but all of them involve a veterinarian in some way or other. So potentially these animals are staying at the farm longer, right? They can't be sent out. We've got to manage that. We tried approaches of slowing animal growth so that we didn't have this excess amount of animals ready right then at that moment. If we could slow them down, maybe they'd take more time to get to their full weight, and we could wait to send them when the market was a little bit better. Okay? That's a totally different approach when we deal with that. Repurposing vacant facilities that we haven't used in a long time simply to house and keep these animals that we don't know what to do with them. Trying some non-traditional marketing strategies. Euthanasia, depopulation, that's your worst case scenario, but for many, that's where that ended up. With what do? We can't keep these animals here. We can't send them off. We've got to consider how we're going to reduce that number on the production side to make this a manageable amount. Okay, that was a really big interruption, and veterinarians and producers really have had to navigate and continue to have struggles with navigating how we're going to deal with this. Research has been a really big deal. Right here at OSU, we have at the College of Vet Med, we have at least 7 labs that I could think of that are active in SARS-CoV-2 research, several of which are getting publications out. Dr. Miller, who's with us, so Craig Miller right there, I work with him on SARS-CoV-2, and so we're doing a lot on the research side. Turns out veterinarians are really important when it comes to SARS-CoV-2 research because we're trained a little more clinically. We have this broader reach. We understand its species differences. We're really essential when it comes down to the creation for animal models and translational models of disease because we know what that looks like. We're trained in that approach simply to get out with our DVMs. We are taught that One Health approach in a lot of ways. And so that really comes in handy, and a lot of veterinarians have stepped up into that role in the last year and a half. Epidemiology and disease surveillance. ODL at the very start processed over 110,000 human COVID samples. Guys, that's because we have veterinarians. That is herd health at its best, right? I mean, I hate to call people a herd, but that's what we are. You have a pandemic level outbreak, you need a facility that can handle massive amounts of samples and run those and be used to doing that, where there's not this big learning curve in how that's going to happen. And who better to do that than a veterinarian? And so we saw that right here at OSU with ODL stepping up and taking that role and saying, we can actually do this, and then doing it, and doing it very well. And that was a critical need at the beginning of this pandemic. Okay, we have people, so our very own Dr. Jared Taylor serves as the chief science officer at Oklahoma and was the interim epidemiologist as well. Again, background in herd health, One Health, public health, okay? So that veterinarian role finally getting some recognition to go with it on how important that is to how we address and prepare and implement some of our strategies when we deal with the pandemic. Oh, I lost it. Oh, all right. Okay, educationally speaking. All right, so there's a Brady Bunch over there. I'm in the teaching world. My goodness, right? We basically got thrown into a virtual world very quickly. Turns out veterinary medicine is incredibly essential to our world health. Turns out training veterinary students is also incredibly essential to world health. It can't just stop, okay? It has to keep going. And so we shifted to a largely virtual platform early on in order to try and protect those in-person experiences that had to happen by taking those things that we could attempt to accomplish virtually and making them safer, okay? That's a big transition for a lot of instructors who really have not had a lot of formal education in virtual learning to have to make that jump and do that. And so we've seen that as well with continuing education and virtual options, with teaching and virtual options, trying to protect our fourth-year clinical rotation so that they can actually happen as best as they can, and then finding the ways to make that possible. This was not an easy jungle to navigate. Okay, this was incredibly hard, and for those students that are still somewhat living that today, kudos to you guys. Oklahoma State truly has some of the best and the brightest right here. And you can look at what these students have been through in the last year and a half and the way they continue to progress and learn how to reason and think like a doctor and the progress they are making. Yes, good for instructors for doing that, but that's a half and half thing. We meet in the middle. Thank goodness our students are actually capable and able to do that as well. Surprisingly, it mostly worked. We served our communities, so we've donated a lot of PPE. A lot of veterinary clinics have donated PPE. We've administered vaccines ourselves too, and so veterinarians early on were asked to administer vaccines before many of us were eligible to be vaccinated. We were asked to step up and help administer vaccines, and some of us did that, and so that's part of that response as well. A lot of volunteer work, a lot of donating of medical supplies to the human health world in order to do our best to help on that front end for that pandemic. So how do we learn and grow moving forward? We've got to learn advocacy, okay? And we've got to learn that with a fairly unified approach. And so we all need to start thinking about how veterinarians are involved and what we can do to better educate moving forward. We are largely quite a humble profession, which is great, and I don't think we should change that, but I do think we need to change on how we take that and we talk about it. We don't have to go out there with a bunch of arrogance, but we can still be proud of what we do as a profession, and we can start to communicate that to the people around us. We need to be aware of what we're doing as a whole on to actually combat some of these issues that we're seeing in One Health. We know that most emerging diseases are zoonotic. We know that wildlife is going to be incredibly important. Public health is very similar to herd health. We are all well trained in that to some extent. Translational animal models are going to be a big deal. And many of us are community leaders in some way or other already. We already have a voice, and we need to use some of that voice to talk about veterinarians and what we're doing as a profession, okay? White-tailed deer, mentioned it in the last one, that's going to be an interesting topic here over the next few months on continuing to look for some of these reservoirs and surveillance in wildlife and our domestic animals. Where is this coronavirus going? What is the end of this pandemic going to look like, right? And to some extent, there's a decent chance that animals are involved, continue to be involved in that, and certainly that they continue to be involved the next time we have to deal with this again in the future. We can't wait and be reactionary all the time. At some point, we've got to change, and we've got to build our profession up so that we're not scrambling to get ourselves a seat at the table after the fact, right? We got to put ourselves at the table now because we know what we can do to affect and change that. Public education, that's really the number one on here that we can all do a little bit more of. That can be just with your clients. That can be at your local Rotary Club. That can be in a lot of different settings. But giving an awareness for veterinary medicine, what we do, and the wide, broad range of what we are capable of, that's all going to be incredibly important. Sharing some of our foresight. So not just zoonotic emerging diseases, but foodborne illness, Antimicrobial resistance, another huge problem. Veterinarians need to be involved in how we're handling AMR, antimicrobial resistance. Food safety and security. These supply chain interruptions, it would be really nice if we could avoid doing this again and having veterinarians involved in how we're going to handle some of those issues that can potentially come up. Vector-borne disease, increasingly important, in particular as climate starts to slowly change and the regions of these vectors are going to expand and move in different places. And a lot of vector-borne disease results in human disease as well. So there's a big connection there. Okay? I think it's important that we at least be aware of legislative actions and policies in place and support those who are advocating for our profession at that level. That's just part of our professional awareness. And then I think, of course, that it's incredibly important to support our students. Okay? And the better we can prepare and train and encourage our students, regardless of the path they take, okay, the more we can encourage them, the more we can promote diversity in our student body, trying to think about the factors that they're going to be fighting over the next few years. We can't just leave that totally on their shoulders. It's also our responsibility to try and encourage and support them through that. Sorry, I put it in there. There's a lot more, of course, because there was kind of an all over the place. This is in honor of the class of 2011, for the few of you out there. I really wanted to bring it up too. That's Grand Rounds. Guys, it hasn't changed, right? Grand Rounds are amazing. I go to them frequently. I'm the Iowa There's something about that clinical year at 8 a.m. where I just wanted to point out that the back row looks about the same, regardless. So students, we know we were there once. So, and with that, does anyone have, I've got about 5 minutes, so does anyone have any other questions for me on any of those topics or anything else?
We do have a question from the
yeah.
So is an intranasal vaccine an option for both companion animals or ourselves as we move forward in vaccine research and development?
Sure, yeah. So the question is an intranasal vaccine and potentially an option with animals or even for ourselves as we move forward in that vaccine research world, right? Absolutely. Especially when we're talking about a disease that's largely going to cause mild subclinical asymptomatic infections that are fairly restricted at times to that upper respiratory tract. And so we know some basic immunology there, right, as far as what immunoglobulins are going to pop up, depending on whether we're talking about mucosal immunity, systemic immunity. And intranasal vaccines are really pretty good at rapid development of some of that mucosal immunity. And so I think that's absolutely an option. On the counter side of that, we're also going to have to make sure that an intranasal vaccine still is preventing severe disease very well, particularly in vulnerable populations. So on the animal side, it really does, though, have a lot of feasibility, but we're a ways out from really having something regularly used on that front. Good question, though. Other questions? Yes?
I was just in the exhibit hall and talking with one of the representatives, and they said there's a clinic in Oklahoma City that advertises, bring your pets in, we'll give them COVID vaccinations.
Oh.
So, what's going on there?
Yeah, so I have no idea. So the question is it may be a local clinic that is advertising giving COVID vaccines to pets. And I'm not aware of that situation. What I can say is that it is not an approved process at this point, not in our companion animals. Okay? So on that, we just don't know enough about how much it's really going to do to prevent and limit spread. On the other side, we do need to walk this line of not being too alarmist about the risks that pets pose to people. I know there have been stories of people who want to get rid of their pets suddenly because they think their dog or their cat's going to give their family COVID. Turns out that risk right now is incredibly low. It could change, but it's very low right now, and so we need to be really careful in our messaging on how we handle that as well. So until we have official approval with that, we'll have to see where that goes.
All right, thank We now have a short break of 15 minutes. We'll be back in this room for our final general session at 10:15.
I tried to stay on time. Oh, you were good. I apologize.